welcome to the grant writing toolbox session. Show of hands in the room, I'm just kind of curious, how many of you have written grants before for Tyco specifically? Okay. And have you written grants for things other than Tyco in your experience? Kind of mixed in the room, right? And that's okay. Honestly, a lot of people, I think, stop themselves from trying to write grants before they even start because they don't know where to begin. And I've written tons of grants at this point as a freelance grant writer and also as somebody in development for organizations. I used to write them. I used to be on both sides of deciding who gets money or who is applying for money for grants organizations. So over time, I've really adapted and created kind of like this file that I take with me to every business I work at called the Toolbox. And that's what I want to share with everybody today. So if it's new to you, this is going to feel less daunting. You can take it one step at a time. And if it's something that you've done before, hopefully by developing and talking about this toolbox today, you'll be able to get more efficient at writing those grants so they're not too time consuming or too much of a pain to actually produce them more rapidly with deadlines that approach and things like that. And because this is Tyco Community Alliance, and I love Tyco personally, the big metaphor today is going to be creating a grant writing toolbox is just like building a drum, right? So there's different parts of a drum that all come together to become a Tyco. Your grant writing toolbox is the same exact way. So we'll just go ahead and get things started. We're going to identify very quickly, again, what a grant writing toolbox is. We want to establish and really stress how important it is to have one and why you would want one, and what is included in a grant writing toolbox. For this presentation, we've broken it down into 4 categories. So each toolbox has some type of head, bio, body, and con, and that will make more sense as we go through the presentation today. I'll also share just some tips and tricks of mine that I always recommend as food for thought at the end of the presentation. And after that, it's really just open discussion time, Q&A. We'll shut the cameras off. That part of the session will not be recorded. So you can ask some pretty personal questions about your group. And, you know, it would be a safe space, essentially. So let's go ahead and get things started. Again, while each grant application is unique, there's often major categories of information and data that all grants need when you submit an application. The idea of a toolbox really is to centralize that information, that universal information, so that you can cut and paste it, copy and paste it wherever you need to apply for as many or as little grants as you want at any one point in time. Some examples that I think everyone instinctively knows, of course, is the name of your group, your tax ID, contact information, that stuff that you're going to have on every application. There's actually other categories of information too that we're going to unpack and go through further today. Examples of this include narratives. And if you're not familiar with that term, the narrative questions on a grant are just the long form word answers that you would put in a grant application. So it wouldn't be something like date of birth, which is numeric and it's very easy. It would be like, describe your programs. And then you have to explain with a narrative answer, right? So that's the type of stuff that we're going to look at today. Why have a grant writing toolbox? So we talked a little bit about it already, but grant writing toolboxes really just help you be more efficient. I don't know how you all function with Tyco, maybe day jobs, other things, kids, you know, you've got lives going on. I would rather be not taking forever to write a grant application. So if I can cut and paste and make a really solid application with much less work and much less time, that's what I'm going to default set to do. And that's how I started using toolboxes and things like this in my own professional background. So toolboxes, of course, have other benefits that you can apply for multiple grants at the same time, helps you, you know, be efficient, save that time. It helps you document your responses because I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you were about to submit your homework and you hit submit and it deletes and you lose everything because you didn't have a backup draft somewhere. That's the worst feeling ever, right? So Toolbox helps actually avoid that as well because it's all canned responses that you keep in a centralized, safe place. And then organizing where all this information exists actually can just make you more efficient in seeking out grants and applying for grants in the future. And grant seeking is one of the topics we'll be talking about in the next 2 months. So this topic today is part of a 3-part series just about different aspects of grants. So the real question is, what should we put inside of your grant writing toolbox? So, drum roll, please. Let's build this drum. I see one smirk. Okay, the joke will get funnier as the presentation goes on, I promise. So, like, we talk about breaking it down into 4 major categories in a grant writing toolbox. Okay. The head is going to be the first thing that grantors or funders see. That's going to be all of your front facing, usually public access information that you would put on a website or things like that. Then you have the bio. That's the information that holds the organization together. So these are fun facts like when you were founded, when you became a 501c3, like that type of information. The body is what your org is built on. This would include things like the programs or the details of a project if you're applying for a project grant. And then the con really is just the additional resources that make your organization or your project special and unique. It's the stuff that you notice that differentiates it from other drums, right, in the lineup. So that's really what we're looking at, are 4 major elements of a grant writing toolbox: the head, the bio, the body, and the con. These don't have to be really complicated or really stacked lists and categories of things either. Today, I'm going to unpack really like maybe 2 or 3 degrees deep on the type of information in each category to give you an idea of what a good toolbox could look like. So the head, right? That's the thing that the funders see first. This is pretty easy information, very cut and pastable. You probably have it at your fingertips already. This would include the name of your organization or your TYCO group, or the name of the project or the concert, right? Depending on the application and the project. It's also important, if you're not familiar with the acronym DBA, it stands for doing business as. So if you have an alias, which some TYCO groups do, you also need to make note of that in your toolbox. The other important data points include your federal identification number. In the United States, that's called the EIN or the FEIN. With Canada, that's through the CRA, Canadian Revenue Agency. I forget the code they use, but it's your tax. You have to be registered as a charitable organization if you're a nonprofit in Canada. So you'll have a special number for that as well. The UEI is a new numbering system that the United States federal government has adopted. So it is over time outmoding SAM's numbers and DUNS numbers. So if you have those things, you may have to go look at like grants.gov, for example, and find out how you can update and register for a UEI. Because I think by the end of next year, all federally funded entities are only giving grants to applicants that have a UEI number that is current. So definitely take a look at that. And then, of course, phone, address, website, social media handles. Those are pretty straightforward in today's day and age. But it's also really important to know who the point of contact is within your group for any given project or grant. And that can vary from project to project or show to show. So you just want to make note of that somewhere in your toolbox. And that's all the head information. Not too scary, right? Any questions about this section before we move on to the bio? If I'll go ahead and keep talking. If somebody's typing in the chat, we'll address that. So the bio, right, the next level of your toolbox is what holds your organization or your project together. This section outlines really the vision, the mission, the values, and also very importantly, the financial outlook of your group. It may sound counterintuitive, but a lot of funders like to see financially stable applicants that have a good handle on their it's called fiscal health or fiscal state. And almost counterintuitively, like it puts more confidence in them to give you grant money if they already know that you're in a good place financially. So it's all in that picture and how you paint it with this part of your toolbox. So as an example, right, the vision statement is usually a 1 to 2 sentence statement about the vision of your concert or the project or your group itself. And then your mission, I actually recommend you have 4 different versions of your mission statement in your toolbox, because this is the one that varies the most from grant to grant. So I want to know in one sentence, what is the mission of, we'll use an example in the room of Puna Taiko, right? Give me a one sentence, or give me a 100-word description of your mission for Portland Taiko, or 250 words, or 500 words. These narrative responses based on word or character count, you're not really going to be able to know until you're in that application in their portal applying for these things. So if you already have these canned responses like scaled up and down as you need them, really helps you save a lot of time, because I feel like we can speak to our mission very easily, most Tyco groups, but then editing back, like pulling back if it's too much, that takes a lot of time for sure. Another thing in this section of your toolbox would include like core values and key programs. My suggestion for core values is to have a bulleted list of what those are, with maybe like a one sentence example of how that is fulfilled in your organization or your group. And with key programs, I usually recommend like a paragraph description of what that program is. If you're doing this specifically for like a Tyco show or a Tyco concert or a Tyco program, pull key elements out of that program. And that's like, instead of key programs, you're then talking about key elements. If that makes sense to everyone. And then the financial part of this is ideally, I recommend keeping, if you've been around this long, keeping a rolling 3 to 4 years in the toolbox of information. So for example, like if you can see the third drum from the left, it says this year in this image, right? So if I'm writing a grant for a project that's happening this year or next year, that grant application is probably going to want to see what my financials look like now. They're going to want to see what my financials are projected to look like for the next year. And depending on the funder or the application, they may want to know also the history of what I've been doing the last couple of years to see how stable and steady we are as a group. So because of those reasons, I always keep really, like, you could have budget versus actuals, or a P&L, which is a profit and loss statement for the end of each fiscal year that you have. Like, just keep something like that at the ready, because if requested to provide that information, it's so much faster just to have it in a folder that you can just grab and drop really quickly. It also helps you, I think, paint the story a little bit better about your financial outlook when you can speak to like how it's evolved over the last couple of years to now, and what you're hoping to do in the next year. When you try to like sit in the seat of a selection committee for a grant, and they don't know you, they don't know your group, they don't know anything about you, and you drop a whole bunch of numbers in there without context, it's really hard for them to see the full picture of like what you're about and what your goal is, right, with your program. So this is the bio section. This is probably the part for me, like when you're setting up a toolbox fresh with no previously established tools. This section takes the longest to put together, because you want to be happy with, the mission statements. You want to be happy with the content or the formatting of your financials. So this one, if you don't have any of this put together right now, that's okay. We'll talk a little bit with tips and tricks at the end, but I suggest just maybe one bullet at a time, start building this out slowly over time, so that this is a fully flushed section of your grant writing toolbox. Okay, the next section is the body, right? So this is what the org or the project is built on. This outlines your main programs in greater detail. So instead of just a single paragraph or a couple sentences like we had in the bio section, this will now talk about, like, in 200 words or up to 2 pages, project activities, programs, elements of the work that we do, including project timelines and budgets. So this goes into more detail. This is, of course, if you're applying for grants that are more specific to like funding the group itself and its operations, and not so much a specific show or a concert. If you're applying for a grant for a specific concert, I think a single timeline of the planning of that concert is sufficient, as well as the budget for that, right? You don't need to get into really like detail. We're going to spend 87 cents on stamps for this and things of that nature. The other thing in this section of a toolbox, and this is something that is asked with many different types of words and grant applications, but they're really trying to assess the impact of your program, the impact of your group. So community impact, in 2 paragraphs, if you can describe how you impact the community through what you do, that's really important. because this question is going to be asked like 20 different ways in a grant application, whether they're asking directly about demographic questions, like how many children will be impacted by this show, or they're more passive about it, like to your estimate, what is the scope of reach of this concert? It's all coming back to impact, because what the funder wants to do is be able to brag about all of these amazing programs and projects that they funded, and they want to be able to show with numbers what that impact was through their funding specifically. So if you can paint that picture through your toolbox in advance, it sets you up for that much more success when you're ready to start doing applications. Similarly, audience is something that I always have a section of like a paragraph or two devoted to. For Tyco Community Alliance, our audience generally, like we talk about, it's the Tyco community, right? And we can share that in this space, and people know what the Tyco community kind of looks like and feels like. But if I'm applying for a grant with the National Endowment of the Arts, they have no idea what the Tyco community looks like, right? So I have to describe that audience, that community, in greater detail. And so any information from like Tyco Census, for example, you're welcome to use to help describe what this audience is. But depending on your project, that might not even be who you're describing. You may be wanting to put on a show for like veterans, right? You're doing a concert series for veterans in your area. So then describe what the veteran audience looks like in your region. And that's the audience you're talking about for this grant, right? And then the final thing that's very important, and it often goes missed when you're trying to write an application as you go, is how do you plan to measure or evaluate your work? This can be done in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's a survey, right, that happens after a show or after a program. Sometimes it's just, more qualitative, like you're just having a conversation with the audience to see if this was valuable and if it should be done again. Whatever steps you take to measure and reflect on how this can be improved upon in the future, funders actually want to know about that as well. Because again, they're going to report in as quantitative a way as possible for them, like the impact of something, how it was measured as successful or not successful, and what they can brag about because, oh, look, they gave this money to support XYZ project. So I hope that makes sense. This is another portion of the toolbox that takes a little bit of time to put together. And generally speaking, if you're talking about general operations for your group, you can have like some canned responses that exist for most applications in this area. But if you're also applying for grants that are project-based or performance-based, you may have to create mini versions of this section of the toolbox specific to those, because it wouldn't make sense to do like TCA's full operational budget for the year if I was writing a grant specifically for an ATC, right? So the final section of the toolbox is the con. These are what I call the nice to haves. So you don't need to have these for every application necessarily, but man, does it save you a lot of time if you already have them saved in a file somewhere. So the nice to haves, because some funders ask for it, some don't, include things like letters of recommendation. If they're more than 2 years old, I refresh and get new ones. These could be from longstanding partners or allies of your group. These could be from prominent members of the community. These can be from previous clients, but letters of recommendation are always very important. Also, letters of commitment help affirm that not only do you know what you're doing, but you've planned well enough that you have commitment from people to do a project. An example that TCA does in-house, because we believe in transparently sharing this stuff with everybody, is when we go to apply for big federal funding from like National Endowment of the Arts, we will often have 1 or 2 letters of commitment from instructors in the Tyco community saying that they plan to teach at an upcoming conference, or they plan to do this as part of our programming. And that affirmation, right, that commitment on paper really speaks volumes to, 1, our ability to be organized and plan ahead, and 2, that we have thought this through as far as the project goes, and it will be successful and is deserving of that funding. Another great thing is to just keep a sample reel or photos and some type of inventory of them, of work samples that you could share for any grant application. One of the things I would always note is nowadays when you submit video, any kind of media, to be honest, they want to make sure that there's a description and some context to it. So you could either tag those files in that way, or you can keep another spreadsheet in the same folder as these pictures so that you know like what each image is about. But that will also help in producing like a sentence description about such and such photo that you're featuring. It's also a great way to keep track of if you have the permissions and the rights to actually share those images in this way. For some groups, managing that can be a little bit more difficult. So I suggest just putting it and embedding it as part of your toolbox to make sure that if you are using images as work samples, that you have like free and clear permission to use and do that in that way. So that is the major 4 sections of a toolbox. It's a lot of information, and you'll get a copy of this, of course, if you need the recording to help with bullets or anything. But the tips and tricks that I have with building a toolbox, number 1, and this is with any financial stuff that I would recommend. So any topics in Doros and Cents, this is usually the number 1 thing. Do not overwhelm yourself. This is a lot. And this is a lot to build to then use to apply for grants that aren't even guaranteed funds yet. And I realize that. So don't overwhelm. Identify what you have the capacity to create and start building this toolbox slowly over time. And each time you write an application, you're going to learn something new or you're going to refine it. This toolbox is a living thing. It's organic and it will evolve. The toolbox that we have here at TCA pretty much has refaced itself, I want to say like 20 times in the last 2 or 3 years. With every grant that we're writing and producing for ourselves, we feature ourselves a little bit better every time. So it is okay for it not to be perfect the first time or to even be fully complete the first time. The first step is just taking a first step and start building the toolbox. To that end, right, pick the categories that you can build one step at a time in a way that makes sense. That category, the head, is very quick and easy information. And if you put it all together on a spreadsheet and just start a folder that says Grant Toolbox, man, do you feel so accomplished because you've got a whole section done, right? And it's not a heavy lift. This is even something that, you know, if you have people co-writing these applications with you in your group, like you can delegate and take turns like covering different categories of this as well. For your own sanity, label things and file them to manage for long-term use. So think about these things, especially in the age of like cloud-based shared documents and stuff. Who's going to have access to this and who can edit it? Sometimes those are the same people, sometimes they're different. Whatever works best for you, like just make sure you're comfortable with that. Version control is also super incredibly important. Here at TCA, we have started evolving to where like we are date stamping stuff at the front end of a file name, so that if I look at a draft, I know that today is 3/29/24, and I can look at that version and see that is the most current version of a document, versus if I want to look at the original draft of it, we could pull up and it'll say like February 6th, 2024 or something like that. That has helped us here because we work strictly virtually and in the cloud. We barely get together face to face, but you may adopt a different convention that works for you. And the same just with naming conventions in general. We use here at TCA in the file name, all caps, draft, and all caps, final. So we know which one is the one we're turning in. Which one is, you know, basically been approved essentially to turn in for a grant application. That has worked really well for us. But again, you may adopt a different system. Just be consistent with it when you start doing these more frequently, more productively. And as I said, Toolbox is definitely a living thing. It's organic. It's going to change with time. And that is A-OK. So with that, that is the grant writing toolbox in a nutshell, kind of breeze through it. I'm going to stop this recording and open it up for